All right, well, we've been learning all about Jesus these last few weeks, and Matthew has been recounting for us many of the amazing things that Jesus did, and through these amazing stories, we are learning so much, not only about who Jesus is, but also about who Jesus is to us. Now, the thing we have to remember about all of these amazing things that Jesus did is that he did them as a demonstration of his authority. Now, that's what we saw highlighted last week, and we will continue to see that as an undergirding principle this week. And so, a quick recap: Jesus' authority, what is that? And why is that an important feature of our relationship with Jesus? Simply put, Jesus' authority is his power and his right as Lord over all of creation, including us. Jesus is Lord. And as Lord, he exercises his authority over the circumstances presented to him in these stories. And this has marvelous implications for how he exercises that authority even in our lives today. And so I am very excited to share with you the two stories that we have today, as they are some of the most magnificent things that Jesus did when he walked the earth. And you know what, I will say this: there is indeed an amazing truth within these stories that we can learn as well today. So I know this is really going to help us all. So let's move directly to our first episode, reading from Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 through 27. And let us behold our Lord in the pages of Scripture, and may God also reveal him to our hearts this morning as we begin. Verse 23. Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." So we find the disciples placed in a difficult situation, and that is, to put it mildly. There they are on a boat going along with Jesus, just as many of us, metaphorically speaking, as disciples, are on a journey with Jesus in our own lives. And as they are sailing along, everything is at first rainbows and sunshine. And that is the expectation, isn't it? Because here's Jesus after all, and this boat is taking us all along on God's plan for us. And they certainly did not set out in a storm, but the storm came. And it was not some gentle spring zephyr which overtook them that day, but as the text says, it was indeed a storm, most sudden and furious. The waves, which would have been just fine to see on the outside of the boat — that is the point of a boat, after all, to separate one from the water — well, the boat was not doing its job. Not even remotely. Well, it hadn't sunk yet, but I'll tell you, at that moment, in the disciples' mind, I'm sure of this, that was a mere technicality. We know what the disciples were thinking because they say it to Jesus. The disciples were certain of one thing that day: they were all going to die. Personally, I think of the boat as our own plans in life, the things we as Christians do of our own ingenuity, because ultimately a boat is a great example of human ingenuity. And why do we make boats and plans for our life? To keep the dangers and the troubles away, because the world is in fact a fearful place. So we build boats and we make plans to help us accomplish the things in our life that we feel are worth pursuing. And that's not to say that the boats we build are bad in themselves. I think God made us to build boats and trains and spaceships. He made us as we are, ingenious and creative as we are. Honestly, he made us as a reflection of himself. Now listen, I'm not saying this is all what Matthew meant when he wrote that the disciples were in the boat. What he meant by writing they were in a boat was that they were in a boat, because this was a real thing that happened, and those were the facts. But I want us to realize that every day we are all in that boat there with those disciples in our own way. And we all think rainbows and sunshine because, after all, the one who just cleansed the leper, the one who just healed the centurion's servant and prevented Peter's mother-in-law from dying, well, we're Christians, aren't we? So Jesus is with us, isn't he? And so we think, well, that means something, doesn't it? And of course it does. But it does not always necessarily mean what we think it means. Now let's talk about Jesus. I don't know if anyone here has ever been in a very small boat during a raging storm. Perhaps some of us have, and if perhaps someone has, I can guarantee you one thing that you weren't doing at that particular moment in your life: sleeping. So this must be some sign of Jesus' divinity within itself, that there he is in the middle of this storm with his disciples. Everyone is about to die, and there he is using his divine power to catch a few Z's. Perhaps some of us would like to sleep half as well as Jesus apparently could. Although, on the other hand, perhaps this catatonic state that we find Jesus in is more a reflection of his humanity, and maybe it isn't anything to do with his godhood. Perhaps, after all the ministry and teaching that he had just recently completed, he was absolutely wiped and basically went into the cabin of the ship and passed out unconscious. Now, this is speculation, but what is not speculation is what was going on with the disciples in their humanity. And they were asking the exact thing that we would all be asking and probably have asked ourselves within the last week or month, and maybe even at multiple points over the last few years, if, like the disciples, a sudden storm, a furious storm has come upon us in our lives, right? The storm hits. First, confusion sets in. What's going on? And then fear, like, is this going to be bad? And then a question, where is Jesus anyways? And perhaps there have been times when we've thought to ourselves, after looking at the state of our lives, whether God actually was just sleeping on the job. Well, in this case, he actually was. Now listen, some people will point out that, hey, at least the disciples went to Jesus during their time of crisis, which, no one can argue with the fact that, yes, that is what they did. I'm not sure what else, given their state of mind, they would have done, but fine, good on them. They went to Jesus. Only we know that isn't the point of the story, because when they wake up, Jesus, what he doesn't say is, oh, good on you. You came to me in the middle of the storm of life. No, I'm going to be honest here. Jesus doesn't seem to be thrilled at all that they woke him up. At the very least, what Jesus says, what Jesus points out is, if they had more faith, then they wouldn't have needed to wake him up. What Jesus points out is that if they had more faith, they wouldn't have been so afraid to begin with. So as much as we will always promote coming to Jesus during the storms of life, that's always a great thing to do, that isn't going to be our takeaway today from this story. It can't be. Our takeaway has to be about fear, and it has to be about the relationship between fear and faith as we sail along in the journey of our own life. Now, before we get to that, here's what we have to see. Jesus gets up. He walks over to the storm and says, "Quiet down, can't you see a guy's trying to sleep?" No, just kidding. But basically, that is the gist of it. Jesus goes, "Shh, be still." And the storm is like, "Right, Lord, sorry, Lord, right away, sir." And that's it. Stillness, perfect peace, all is well. And that, my friends, was a demonstration of Jesus' power. Well, really, if we are going to be true to Matthew's focus here in this chapter, that was a demonstration of Jesus' authority. Not over us directly in this case, interestingly enough, but over everything that could ever affect us. And the disciples' reaction to all of this is to ask themselves, what kind of a man does this? And you know what? There is really only one answer. Here is Psalm 104 about God as he created the world. Are you ready? Here we go. Psalm 104, verse 5. He set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved. You covered it with the watery depths as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains, but at your rebuke, the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder, they took to flight. So to answer the question that the disciples asked, there can only be one answer. This man was not just a prophet. This man was not just the Messiah. This man was God. For he is not just one who performs miracles on God's borrowed power. This is the one who calms every storm on his own authority. Now, the demons in our next episode will actually answer the question that the disciples ask here. That's kind of a cool literary thing that happens. But before we get there, I just want to touch on this. This story shows us very clearly who Jesus is. But it also shows us very clearly who Jesus needs to be in our lives, especially relating to fear. There are two main points I think we need to keep in mind, which are legitimate takeaways from this story pertaining to our own relationship with God. First, the more faith we have, the less we will let fear control our actions. But also this second point. When we do fall victim to the fears of life, Jesus does not cast us away, but brings us even closer to himself. Let's talk about that last one first. Jesus' reaction to the disciples when they wake him up is not, you have no faith at all. No. Jesus understands that the disciples' failure does not reflect the fact that they are no disciples at all, but rather it does reflect that they have room to grow as disciples. Now listen, in giving them grace, he doesn't justify their fear. In fact, he rebukes them before he rebukes the storm. Because look, Jesus accepts us as we are, absolutely. But he always encourages us to be better than we are. And then he helps us to be better. Because that is the point of this calming of the storm. Because what the disciples needed in their lives was not only a rebuke, you did bad, but also a demonstration. They needed to see why they should not have even woken him up. They needed to see why their fearful state was wrong. And why was it wrong? What was the demonstration even meant to show? Simply this, that Jesus has authority over everything that could possibly cause us to be afraid. And Jesus is sleeping. Well, that was just a mere technicality. Jesus may have been sleeping in his human form, but God was still on the throne. And even more, you know what? That boat was doing its job. And that boat did have Jesus in it. And that boat was sailing those disciples along on God's plan for them. And that's what their faith should have known. And in the knowing, faith should have killed that hideous fear as soon as it raised its ugly head. No, this is where I'm supposed to be. No, this is God's plan for me. No, God is with me, and whatever comes against me, nothing can undo the thing that God is doing in my life and with my life. Because my life belongs to God. It will end on the day he decides, and not a day before. Because there is literally nothing in this world that can override or supersede his authority. And there is nothing that can ever separate us from his love. And the real issue was not the storm around the disciples that day. The real issue was the storm within. And speaking of storms within, do we have another one in this next story. Let's read about that now. Verse 28. When he arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. "Oh, what do you want with us, Son of God?" they shouted. "Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" Now, some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, "If you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs." He said to them, "Go." So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. Those tending the pigs ran off, went into the town and reported all this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And then the whole town went out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave their region. I think it helps to see how these 2 stories that we've read this morning are actually so related. Because as Christians, there can be storms within us. But for those who are not followers of Christ, there can be much worse. And let us look at the situation of these 2 men. Where did they come from? Now, it says that they were coming from the tombs. And some may say, well, as demon-possessed men, they got kicked out of the town. They probably lived there or something. Well, yeah, sure. But why not live in the hills? Why not live in the caves? And remember, the disciples had been sure of one thing out on that lake, of their immediate proximity to death. And now God is like, is that what you thought? Here, I want to show you something. And here come 2 men, so far from God, so far from the life of God that can only come through faith, that they are infested with demons and literally living in a graveyard. These men are so far from the source of life that they have lost their identity as human beings to the point where they don't even speak for themselves anymore. But the sin that dwells within them, the evil that embodies them, has become their identity, and so the demons speak for them now. And the demons control them, even as sin and evil sweep along so many in this world. They are consumed utterly by death and darkness. And look how they have lived in violence towards others. And listen, violence takes many forms. You can be sure that evil people are always violent in some way, because in their rebellion against God, ultimately they come to hate life itself. And so these men, they come up from the tombs, for that is where they live now. But look at the text. No one could even approach these men. No one could reach them. No amount of psychology, no amount of social services or education or anger management was going to be able to break through to these men, and yet Jesus is passing by. And the men come running out against him. And what is all of this about? Right? You look at it, if the demons were so afraid of him, why not run in the other direction? Because they know there is no escaping God's authority. Not even demons can escape it. And so they run out against him, but then they say, what do you want with us, Son of God? Have you come to torture us before the appointed time? And what does this mean? Well, first off, they mention the appointed time, and that could only mean one thing: the day of judgment. The day when God's authority over everything that lives will be exercised to its fullest extent. Even these filthy demons know they are accountable to God. And every human being knows it as well. Deep down, we know we trick ourselves into thinking we can run in the other direction, and some do. So in a way, these demons know better than some human beings. But in a way, they are no better because they ask, "Are you here to torture us?" Which is ridiculous. Can you imagine it? Jesus says, "Why, yes, I thought we needed a good diversion, so we came to torture you. That's sure to take our minds off that incident on the lake." I mean, what a thing to say to God. Which shows that for all of their awareness of God, their understanding of who He is has been twisted by their own evil. They are the ones torturing these men. And so they project that onto God as if He could be anything like them. And so this they have in common with fallen humanity. But again, they distinguish themselves because, they do at least recognize Jesus exactly for who He is, as the Son of God, who as God has the ultimate authority over every created thing. And this is, by the way, the answer to the very question the disciples were still trying to figure out. What kind of man is this, that even the winds and the waves obey Him? And yes, the demons as well. So the demons have the answer. The demons are forced to obey Him, but they still haggle with Him a little. And so He casts them out of these men and into those poor little piggies. That's at least where they choose to go. And who throw themselves off of the cliff into the waters to drown, by the way, as the disciples thought was to be their fate just moments ago. But here these piggies show us that they would rather take that fate over the one that these two men had lived with for years. And Jesus doesn't really care what the demons wanted, by the way. But I do believe this was to demonstrate to the disciples this very important point. You know what? In light of their struggles with fear in the previous episode, there are some things that are far worse than death. Now, some of us, even as Christians, we may have a very bad situation in our lives. And it is fair to wonder, during situations like these, during times of life such as these, it is fair to wonder what God is doing in all of this mess. But we do know, as Christians, that God is doing something. But we also have to realize there are people living lives, even right now, today, whose lives are so twisted by sin, so lost in utter darkness and misery, so bereft of the good of their original human purpose, that death would be far better for them. But the point of this story is not that all is lost, even for people like that. The point of this story is that Jesus can free us from anything. If we have fear in our hearts, we can be freed from that. If we have been consumed by any sin, any addiction or self-destructive behavior, any misery, physical, emotional, spiritual, Jesus can free us from that as well. Even the demons must obey Jesus. And if all of this is true, what does that mean for us today? It means, why wouldn't we put our faith into Jesus? Why wouldn't we give our faith to Him? And I don't mean just say, "Oh yeah, we're a Christian." I mean give our faith to Him in such a radical way that as we are going about our lives every day, we can say, "Yes, this is where I am supposed to be. Yes, This is God's plan for me. Yes, I know God is with me in whatever comes against me. Yes, I can, because yes, He can, and yes, He will. I know He will, because my life belongs to God. And He is the master of the winds and the waves, and He will calm these storms in His way, in His time. He is the master of all, and on this truth all of our lives depend. Amen.